guys, we've been having a great conversation so far before we started recording. And again, I want to thank you guys for being here. Thank you so much for your loyalty on this deal. And I really do appreciate you. I really do appreciate each and every one of you. Again, I want to make sure that we get the process down as good as possible before we bring any more guests on board. So, what I'm going to have, what we're actually doing is Peter Salino, who has been helping us out since the beginning on our technical stuff with the podcast. Peter is actually going to be the moderator. So you guys, if you have a question, the process is still going to be the same. You guys just ask a question or whatever. And so, yeah, if anybody has any questions, type it. If you've got it, if you want to get in the queue, type it over on the chat and he'll be the one to unmute you and everything. So if you do have any questions, go ahead, fire away.
Rick, how many miles to go?
As of this morning, let's see here. To go. And since last week that I talked to, since last week when all this got started, I've done a little bit more than 20 miles. And that was due in large part to Marcus's challenge to step it up. And so, yeah, that was a shock when he came across and said, let's do it by the last race of the year, which is November 8th. That I was like, well, can I do a bicycle? Well, I don't want to do a bicycle because very few of those miles have been on a bike. So I'm going to do them all on foot. So we have 329 miles to go.
2 weeks, you'll be done.
Yeah, I hear you.
All right, let's go over to Joe Ruck.
I have a question for Steve and Rick. You're put in charge of NASCAR. What's the first change you make?
Age before beauty, Steve. That'd give me a chance to think.
The playoffs. I know Rick is going to disagree with that. Am I made here?
Go ahead.
We got your back.
Yeah, okay.
Start again.
I have learned not to hate the playoffs, but stage racing is an abomination to me. I'm sorry. I don't fully comprehend what it's supposed to be all about. Why not everybody race as long and hard as you can, and why create bonus points for leading stages? It just complicates everything. That to me is something that NASCAR doesn't really need. But again, I know everybody's not going to agree with this, but I've learned to accept the playoffs, and that was hard. But I learned to realize that every other professional sport in this country has a playoff system. So why not NASCAR if it works? But to me, that playoff system becomes more complicated and more created by stage racing. That's what I would do first. If that, that's what I do.
Rick, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, if I was in charge, the first thing that I would do, number one, is I would get rid of stage racing. I would get rid of the championship format. I would go to more of a Bob Latford type championship format. It just seems too complicated to me. And yes, I'm a traditionalist. When I came into the sport, the Bob Latford system was the system that was in place. So that's the one that I grew up on.
Me too.
That's the one that I was familiar with. So yes, that's going to be the one that's most comfortable to me. But the championship format, I just don't. It just doesn't do anything for me. Now, the next thing that I would do on day one would be to hire people to sell the sport who love the sport. I think right now we have a lot of people in some pretty high up positions who are selling the sport, marketing the sport, social media for the sport. They're doing it and they're doing a good job, but they could also tomorrow move to Procter and Gamble and do the same thing for Tide. So I think in order to be able to truly sell a product, you've got to love that product. You've got to live, sleep, eat, breathe that product. And that's the reason why I've been so passionate about getting this scene archive done, is because when I first got into the sport, it was my dream to work for Winston Cup Scene. And the day that Steve and Deb hired me, it remains to this day one of the greatest days of my life. And so to be able to say that I've got my name in maybe a third of these newspapers back there means a lot to me. And so I want to be able to preserve these newspapers because it's history that can't get lost. It's stories about drivers that we have long since forgotten. This week's issue of the week on the podcast had a story about James Hilton Jr., Tweety. And that's a name that not a lot of people know. But he was in that sport for a long time, had a lot of great friends, a lot of great stories. And unfortunately, he was with his dad when they had that accident. Both of them lost their lives. And so when I'm flipping through, that's actually one of the papers that I had already digitized, scanned myself. And so when I got to that page, it was kind of eye-opening, because I know his name as somebody who lost their lives in a traffic accident. But when I read that story, it brought him back to life for a few moments. So that would be the thing that I would change, and I think would be very important to change, would be to get people in positions of authority who love the sport and let them be in charge of selling it.
Rick, that was good, but you forgot to make me president and give me keys to the jet.
Well, I would do away with the championship format.
Do away with Peter. Hey.
All right. Jeff Markowski, what do you got for us?
Thanks, Peter. I thought you were Colton Herta when you first came up.
I'll run with that one. I'll take that one. That boy's a good wheelman.
Or
I'll
Dennis
put him in a
Miller.
truck any day.
Steve, tell me about Tom Higgins. Was he as a good storyteller in print or in person as he was in his writings?
Oh, my Lord. Are you kidding me? Tom Higgins had the best ability to tell a story than any other person I've ever heard. He has absolutely, at one point, could transfix an entire room to listen to the stories he had to tell. And most of them were about him growing up in Burnsville, North Carolina, in the Carolina Mountains. He would tell stories about his father, the game warden. He would tell stories about guys like Jiggs Briggs, Mumsy Melloway, and characters like that, and hold people absolutely transfixed. And that was one of his gifts. I wish you could have been there when he told one of his stories. The way he told it, I could tell the same story and not come across like Tom. And this is what endeared him to a lot of people. And I'm glad you asked that question, because as much as I think people want to remember Tom Higgins is a great storyteller, not only about his family and home back in Burnsville, but about NASCAR and characters like Tiny Lund and who we went fishing with, and Buddy Baker, and people like that. He could tell those great stories about them. The fact should never be lost that when it came to writing about NASCAR, there was no one who worked longer and harder than Tom. He was very, very prolific. He was very, very accurate. He was very, very, his storytelling came across in his feature stories, and he did it constantly for years, where some guys, including me, were only responsible for 1, 2, 3 stories a week. Not only was he responsible for every story that went on during the week at a racetrack, he was also the outdoors writer for the Observer. And he was writing outdoor stories at the same time he was at the track. His stories would appear in the paper in prolific amounts. One time he had 12 byline stories in one Sunday edition.
Wow.
That needs to be remembered about Tom Higgins as much as his great personality and his storytelling. He's won every award there is to win in NASCAR journalism, and he's deserved every one of them, very much so.
All right. Thank you, Steve.
Mhm.
Wow. The 12 in one paper is tough. That is legendary.
One issue. Issue.
That's amazing.
All right, we're going to Hallie Emery.
Thanks, Peter. Hey, Steve and Rick, during your times at the scene from your hire date till the end of the publication, for both of you, which race did you want to be at to cover in person that you did not have the opportunity to?
Rick, go ahead.
I actually was there that morning, that afternoon, but at Bristol in August of '99, I was having some chest pains, and so it was hot, and went to the infield care center and wound up going home that day. And if I had not gone home, I would have been squarely in the middle of the Earnhardt, Terry Labonte rattle his cage situation. And so I have always regretted missing that, because that would have been cool to be a part of. And I really felt like I let everybody down by not being there. And so that was one. The other, I don't know, it was necessarily a race or anything, but the other interview that I'm sorry that I missed out on was the interview at Richmond in the fall of the year 2000, where Earnhardt got 3 or 4 of the reporters together and proceeded to just absolutely lambast NASCAR and lambast safety. And that was the day that he gave the final, the famous, tie a kerosene rag around your candy asses and all that. And I would have loved to have been in on that interview. Number one, it was pretty extraordinary at that point for Dale Earnhardt to be searching out reporters. Reporters searched him out at that point, and more often than not, quite often got turned down. But he actually had J.R. Rhodes go out and get Tom Jensen, who was the executive editor at Scene at that time. He also got David Poole, Monty Dutton, and I believe Ray Cooper. And so that was 4 of the heaviest hitters in the sport at that time. And when I say heaviest, I mean that literally and figuratively. So if that was the criteria, I'm surprised I didn't get the call. But just because of everything that he said that day would have been pretty extraordinary. So that's one interview that I would have loved to have been in on.
Well, for me, it's very simple. 1979 at Ontario and 1980 at Ontario. The paper did not have the budget to send me out to cover those races. And by the paper, I mean Scene. As we all know, what happened in '79 with Darrell leading the points by a slim margin, going out to that race and ultimately having troubles in that race and losing it to Richard Petty by 11 points. At that time, the closest finish in NASCAR history, which would in a great story to write. Then the next year, in Dale Earnhardt's second full year of racing, he goes out to Ontario. He has a chance to win the championship. And as everybody probably knows, he tried every way on earth to give it away that day. But he did prevail, and he won the championship, and he became, of course, the only driver ever to win a championship in his second year of competition. Now, you take those two stories taking place at the same track in the same consecutive years. Those are great, great racing stories that remain with us today. And unfortunately, I was not able to be there to cast my views of either one of them, and I would have loved to have been.
You could have written a book called NASCAR's second and third greatest races.
Well, nobody read it.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we're going to Chris Perry.
Thanks, Pete. So I'm just curious, was there ever a driver, and I'm not saying you got to name names, but maybe somebody that you just were like, how did you get into the Cup Series? Just the talent level wasn't there or something. Did you ever just, it just, you know what I mean? Like, how did, I'm sure it's happened, I guess is my point.
Oh, during my early years, I could list you about 6 or 7 of them. That you wonder, how in the world could these guys come out here and race? Now, at the time, being young and inexperienced, I didn't really say that to start with. But as it went on, they still come out there and try to compete in races, and knowing they had no way of doing anything much except maybe, paying for the money to go out to that track. I'm talking Dean Dalton, Eddie Yarborough, Joe Ferson. I mean, the list goes on and on. And what baffled me was they kept coming back. Maybe not for the full schedule, but they kept coming back. And then about the mid-'70s, and you may know this story, they got the break they needed because the independents, as they were called back then, rose up and just went against NASCAR and said, if you don't do something to make us help pay our bills, we're gone. And at that time, you might have had 5, 6, 7, 8 guys to a race, and that's not good for the sport. And under the leadership of James Hilton, they did fashion themselves a deal with NASCAR, which guaranteed them show money for every race they attempted to qualify and enter and qualify. Now, if they did that, they got the money. So that guaranteed NASCAR that they would have a full field for every race. Now, after that point, things changed somewhat. But before that point, boy, I could sit there, you could sit there with me and say, what is this guy doing? There's no way these 7, 8, 9, 10 guys are going to make any money and last in the sport. That's the way it was back then.
I don't know where I said it. I think it was on something like PRN's Pit Reporters, because I couldn't find a reference to it in the newspaper in Scene. But I once insinuated that a certain driver whose name shall remain nameless, Larry Gunzelman. But and Brian, I think, knows this story because he's laughing already. But I insinuated on the radio. It must have been on one of the radio shows I did. But I said that that Larry Gunzelman's team should change his number from 16 to M16 since he was such a weapon on the racetrack. Now, for some reason, he got upset about that. I don't know why. I mean, I just called it as I saw it. I mean, whatever. But the next weekend was Talladega, and I went to the drivers' meeting. And after the drivers' meeting was over, I saw Larry headed my way, and it wasn't to ask me how I was doing. And I'm telling you, that is as close to getting punched by a driver that I ever got. And yeah, he was hot, and so that was one thing. But then after, and no, it wasn't, we didn't come to blows or anything like that, but we did go our separate ways. I walked out to the garage, and I just happened to be walking by the 16 car. I think it was the Wayne Day car from out of Nashville, the Nashville area. And somebody, I think it was one of our photographers, got my attention and said, "Look at the car number." And his team had actually put a small M next to the 16 on his car. And so I thought that was the coolest thing I had ever seen. And the photographer that had gotten my attention got a picture of it. And I would give anything to have a picture of that, because I just thought that was funny. So, yeah, there were a couple of guys in the Busch Series at that time who I would probably lump into that category. There was a guy by the name of Brian Weber at the time who was just showing up and literally just making a few laps and then heading to the garage area. He got on pit road at one time, and they wouldn't let him start the race because he hadn't even bothered to line up a score. And so they wouldn't let him start the race. But that, there are several like that. But yeah, I don't know.
All right, we're going to Brian Hallman.
Skip him.
Is he here?
He's still muted. Brian, unmute it.
How about now?
There you go.
Okay. Rick, you just kind of touched on one of the things there. I'd kind of like to hear Steve's side too. And I know that I read the paper every week. So, I didn't just look at the pictures. And I know that some of the drivers, some of the crew chiefs would get pissed off about some things that were written. I know Kenny Bruce wrote a story about Ernie Irvan one time, and it was an amazing story. It's when you say Kenny Bruce's name, it's the first thing I think about was that feature he wrote on Ernie. But Steve, since Rick already answered that, did you ever have a driver just like really get pissed off at you for something you wrote?
Yeah, I did. You might remember this, Brian. It was several years ago, and Tony Stewart had not been around that long, but he was not used to the NASCAR environment. He didn't really like the fact that people were bothering him for his time, and he just wanted to be kept to himself, do his job. Did not understand that when it came to NASCAR, when the fans ask you something, when the media asks you something, you have the job. So he sat down with Jeff Owens, and he told a story. He told the complete story about how miserable he was and how he wanted to go and do something else. And he could not stand the fans, and he could not stand the media. Jeff wrote the story in scene, every single word. And I knew that the story was accurate because I knew Jeff, just as you did. Of course the story was accurate. Well, come to Sonoma. After that story came out, Tony sought me out. He said, "I want to see you in my hauler." I said, "Why me?" He said, "I want to talk to you." Okay. So I met him in his hauler, and he came in, and he started in. The reason he started in was that week before on television in the old Inside NASCAR show that I was on, we did that story on that. And Mike Massaro was interviewing and held up that story about his complaints. And they asked me to comment on it. I said, "Well, Tony, looks like you have some things to learn about NASCAR. I suggest you learn faster." And he didn't like that worth a hoot. So I met him in the back of his hauler, and it was a civil discussion. You know, he tried to tell me I didn't know this and I didn't know that. I said, Tony, I've been around for 30 years. Yeah, I do know this and I do know that. And the simple fact of the matter to me is you have to get past this and learn how to deal with this, what this sport is. So that was the confrontation, the only confrontation I had with the driver in the back of his hauler. Funny thing is, at the end of the season, when everything had passed, Tony said to me, I was just trying to save my job. I spent the whole year trying to save my job because of that story. Meaning, of course, you were right. And Jeff was right to print what he did. I was trying to make sure that I could have a ride for next year and get past all of this. That was as close as to an apology he was going to get with it. But ever since that time, surprisingly enough, even though Tony still had his episodes, and Brian, you know what they were, in the future, never was with me. It was always a handshake and a nice, friendly gesture after that.
Well, I think making people mad just comes with the job. I mean, when you're a journalist, you present both sides of the story, or you try to, and whoever gets their feelings hurt is going to get their feelings hurt. And when I started at Scene, if somebody had said something to me about not liking anything that I wrote, I mean, it would just kill me. I mean, I was trying to please everybody.
Can't do that.
But I learned very quickly that you have to have a very thick skin as a journalist.
And
you absolutely have to have a thick skin.
Not only news stories, but if you're in charge of writing opinions and columns, and you write those opinions and columns, and everybody agrees with you, you're doing something wrong.
Yeah.
You're doing something wrong.
On the photo side, we had issues too, though. There'd be times when we would get waved off by drivers, or
sure,
PR reps would run interference after a race. If something, we looked for something. We knew if somebody might go after somebody. And so you'd have a PR rep kind of stay between you and your subject. And so, we had it on our side a little bit too, but not as bad as y'all did.
All right, guys, we're going to Chris Wolf, and then we'll go to Matt Miles after that.
Hey, Steve. One of my favorite documentaries from the late 90s, I guess, documentary or set of videos was the Stock Car Legends reunion, and I know that you were a part of that. And I had originally purchased it on VHS, and I kind of regretted not having it on DVD, and I recently found it on YouTube. Somebody uploaded all the episodes. I was wondering if you might be able to give us a little bit of the background on how that came together. And I did notice, oddly enough, that, and I wondered back then, and then I kind of remembered that I still wasn't sure why, but for whatever reason, they didn't include Richard Petty or Dale Earnhardt. And even Richard Childress was there, but not Earnhardt. So,
I don't know the full details about how that came about, but I was told about it. And we mean Tom Higgins and I, were the only two writers invited to join that crowd. And it came about, and we went to Nashville, and I had no idea what we were going to do. And so they told us, and we all met in one room with cameras and boom mics, and we're sitting on Raptors going up, and it was just conducted by Eli Gold. And the only thing that the rules were that you toss out a subject and everybody talk about it. And when you want to talk about it, just jump in and talk about it. And that's the reason I think I got 4 volumes of that thing out there. And it was a lot of fun because the guys opened up. They didn't, you've seen it, they didn't hold back. And they were funny and hilarious. And it was very, very entertaining. And I was proud to be a part of it. Now, Tom and I didn't take part all that much, but we were in it, particularly when Buddy Baker was sitting next to me. He told the story, and you know this one a bit, about being, I think it was Maryville, Tennessee, and coming out the back of that ambulance, taking him out of the track. coming out the back on that gurney of his and riding down the track and stopping stuff like that. Guys were not afraid to tell those stories. And I really think that if people who love racing have not seen this series of videos, they need to go and do that, because I think, as you iterated, they're not going to be able to find the legends of this sport, any more open and casual and fun than they were in that particular series of tapes. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I kind of found it odd that both Richard Petty and Dale didn't participate.
They chose not to.
Oh, okay.
From what I was told, now I couldn't swear on the Bible on this, but they chose not to, either for other commitments they had. But I can tell you right now, how do I phrase this? Dale was not amenable to being himself at that particular point in time. And that's a shame, because I knew him, of course, as a friend. And if he could talk to people like he talked to me, gosh, what stories you'd hear. But I that's why Childress went.
Yeah, and I know that it would be awesome to see like a newer group, the next generation or whatever, do something like that. But
why? Yeah, sure.
Like what you're saying, there's probably a little bit of hesitation with opening up too much.
The image that these guys are forced to portray today, okay, makes it more difficult for them to sit down and do something like that. Now, I think inwardly they'd love to do it. They would love to do it. But the logistics and the relationships that they have now are a little bit different than they were back then. I think you know that.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right, we're going to Matt Miles, and then Edwin Turner's coming up after that.
All right. How you doing, gentlemen?
Good.
Well, I'm trying to keep up with Rick with walking, so I'm a little behind you there, bud. But every chance I can, I want to try and match the mileage with you guys, and really enjoying what you do. And for me growing up, NASCAR was the peak of NASCAR was kind of that late 80s to mid 90s time frame. And my question for you guys is, where do you guys feel that NASCAR might have peaked in your time covering the sport? And do you think we kind of would get back to where that peak was? I think recently we might have made a few good steps forward, but just curious to see what your guys' thoughts were and in that aspect. And then the second part of my question was, I used to get a magazine called Racing for Kids, and was seen involved with that at all. I know I have at my parents' place somewhere in a couple of boxes, probably the first 2 or 3 years of that publication too, that maybe we could work getting that scanned as well if you guys need them. But just curious about your thoughts on peak NASCAR and the Racing for Kids magazine that was in the early 90s.
I'll start with Racing for Kids. That was a scene publication. That was a Greeks publishing company publication. At the time, at its peak, Greeks Publishing had Scene, Illustrated, a GT Motorsports magazine, a magazine for short tracks, and Racing for Kids. 4 or 5 publications going at one time. Racing for Kids, to me, was a stroke of genius.
It was brilliant. I loved it.
Oh, it was for kids, and we got to produce stories and photographs on their level. And I'm telling you, it was fun to write a story without using big words and long phrases. Just say it as it was. And the only not drawback, but the only rule we made is beer and cigarette sponsors would not be published in Scene. And we did crosswords, we did coloring stuff like that. And I think we made an inroads into younger fans. I really do. And that was part of what went on in NASCAR's peak season. NASCAR's peak, to me, came in the early to mid 90s when NASCAR landed a television contract nationally. Well, naturally, the networks wanted to advertise big time that NASCAR was coming, and they put that stuff all over TV. And people who had no idea much about what NASCAR was all about were curious to come and see. And boy, the numbers went up, 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 up. And I can tell you one thing that illustrates that perfectly. You could go into a Kmart and find an entire section of everything from models to die-cast cars to clothing to beach towels all about NASCAR in a Kmart.
I even had a bedspread.
I'm sure.
When I was a kid.
Yeah.
Yep.
that was the peak time, and that was the glory time. That was also the time they made one big mistake, I think. They took advantage of the money and grew too fast. Even the teams were guilty here because they were charging 20, 25 million for a sponsorship. And that sponsorship not only went to provide the teams with everything they needed to be competitive, they were going out and buying airplanes and RV vehicles to go to the track in and stuff like that. I'm sorry, but they got greedy. And NASCAR got a bit greedy too, because they took that popularity there to a different level. They came out with NASCAR Cafe. They came out with, NASCAR go-kart tracks, NASCAR apparel stores in malls and stuff like that. And as the time dwindled and the popularity waned, you can't find any of those places anywhere now. They're gone. They're gone. So during that boom time, that was it. That was the high water mark for NASCAR, in my opinion. Can they come back? Who knows? I think it's going to be more difficult because our economy has not been the same since those times.
Well, as far as my own personal experience, I think for me, the high water mark was probably the 1998, 1999 Busch Series seasons. That was, listen, I just had fun in the garage because you had a garage full of personalities. And if you couldn't find a story in one truck, all you had to do was go another rig down and you could talk to somebody there. And everybody was they were all characters. Most of the teams were not affiliated with Cup organizations. So you still had characters like Bill Baumgartner. You had characters like, just so many. Clarence Brewer at Bruco Motorsports. You had Todd Wilkerson at Bruco Motorsports. You had Bill Baumgartner at Base Motorsports. You had so many other people. You had Bill Baumgartner at Base Motorsports. So it was just fun. I was literally like a kid in a candy store in that garage for those 2 years in particular. Dale Jr. was in the series at that time, and that was at a time where you could still approach him at the racetrack without having to go through layers and layers of people. And so, yeah, Dale Jr. was great, and I've got just story after story about him. But Jason Keller was in the garage at that time. Of course, Randy LaJoy, Todd Bodine. So yeah, it was fun to be in that garage at that time.
Thank you,
All
guys.
right. We're going to Edwin Turner now.
Hey, Steve, this question is for you.
Yeah.
After I typed it, I said, maybe I attributed too many years to your age. So excuse me. But
no.
He's got a day over 90.
Yeah. So my question was, did you get to cover any of the races before the modern season, when we used to go to so many of the short tracks and all? I gave example like, Spartanburg on dirt, Harris Speedway. That might have been a little before your time, Asheville, Weaverville, things like that. And if not, then, and I was in line with that. What's your first memories of going to races? Where was that?
Oh gosh. Well, to answer your question first time, no, I came along about a year too short for all of those other tracks. They were gone when I got started. And that was in 1971 when I got started. I was not a full-time racing writer at the time. I was just a sports writer for Martinsville. And I came to cover and being in Martinsville, of course, I had to cover the fall race at Martinsville. I had never seen a race in my life. I knew of Richard Petty and I knew of Cale Yarborough, but I didn't know another thing. And for me to have to cover that race was very intimidating. But I've told this story many times. I was very lucky in that Dick Thompson, who was the PR man at Martinsville at that time, took me under his wing and he showed me around and introduced me to drivers. And I got to know some of the drivers just by introduction. And he basically told me what went on. So I covered that first race. I'm sure the story was awful. I didn't understand how two guys could be pitting and the guy leading two guys racing and the guy leading went into the pits and lose the lead. I couldn't even understand how that happened. But eventually, of course, I did learn. But, you know, I was very fortunate in the fact that I had some good teachers in Dick Thompson and Clay Earls. And the one driver that I met that first day I ever went to Martinsville who said, excuse me, more than hello or how are you, he said, good to meet you. Glad you're on board with us. If I can do anything for you, you just let me know. And of course, that was Richard Petty. And I think he became a go-to source, along with Buddy Arrington, who was from Martinsville.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, I had to get to know him. So I learned as it went on. And I was very fortunate to be in that position so soon after all that other stuff, the 52 race week schedules had come to an end. I came on board basically when the Winston Cup era started. So that to me turned out to be very fortunate.
So when did you, was that when you really started going to races or did you go before then?
In 1971, it was in 72 when I came aboard in Roanoke from Martinsville that I started going to races. And mostly, of course, I went to the Martinsville races. I also got to go to Atlanta. And one of the things that I covered at Atlanta is when Bobby Allison won a race in Atlanta in the Chevrolet for Junior Johnson. And that was the first year that Chevrolet came back in